Welcome to this session on conditional transfers, its types and legal effects. I am Dr. Nishant Kumar Jilova from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar National Law University, Sonipat. Today we will explore the fascinating world of conditional property transfers, a key aspect of the Transfer of Property Act 1882. Understanding this concept is crucial as it often plays a defining role in property transactions, legal disputes, and judicial interpretations. Through this lecture, I will guide you in understanding how conditions attached to property transfers impact the rights and responsibilities of the parties involved and determine the validity of property transactions. Let us dive into explore this essential aspect of property law. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to explain the principles of conditional transfers under the Transfer of Property Act 1882, identify and differentiate between types of conditional transfers including conditions, precedent, subsequent, and collateral. Understand the legal criteria for a valid conditional transfer and recognize conditions that are void under the law. Evaluate the legal effects of non-compliance with conditions. Analyze key Supreme Court judgments that have shaped the interpretation of conditional transfers. After completing this lecture, learners will gain a deeper understanding of conditional property transfers, empowering property owners, buyers, and legal professionals. The ability to make better decisions in property transactions by understanding legal implications. Insight into landmark Supreme Court judgments that illustrate the practical application of conditional transfers. So let's start with the introduction to this intriguing topic. In 1882, India passed a very important law called the Transfer of Property Act. This is a law which regulates the way to transfer possession from one person and at the same time outlines the rights and obligation of this possession. The idea of conditional transfers is one of the most interesting pieces of this law. Property is transferred on a conditional basis dependent on a given condition. Since this is an important concept, for instance, that decides the validity if a property transaction or indeed plays a prominent role in dispute resolution and judicial interpretation. Let's say there is a man called A who is a house owner. Then he speaks to his friend B and tells him, I will give you this house provided you get work in the next 6 months. In this case, A has created a criteria for the transfer, that is, B has to get a job first. If this condition is satisfied, the house will be transferred to B. The transfer will not take place if not these transfers are conditional transfers and they are governed by section 25 of the Transfer of Property Act. But there are some conditions that are not permitted under law. It must meet the criteria in order to be considered valid. A condition cannot be illicit, immoral, impossible, bring harm to a third party, or detrimental to that third party. Thus, if X tells Y, I am going to transfer this land to you, but if so, you must do harm to another individual. Such condition will be void because it contravenes the law and public policy. Just as if the condition is something that cannot be done, like going to a fictional place, it would be too. The rules in this are of utmost importance to parties which are involved in the property transactions. It helps legal professionals resolve disputes and to counsel their clients. It allows real property proprietors to define good conditions for transfers. It also protects buyer to know their right and obligations. The legal system on which conditional transfers are based directly impacts how property is handled. One must know about it in practice. Conditional transfers are covered under Section 25 of the Transfer of Property Act 1882. In other words, a transfer of property is only possible if a certain condition by either party applies. Suppose A promises to transfer his property to B, provided B secure a job. Conditions for the property transfer includes A requirements for B to get employment secured. For a conditional transfer to be regarded as valid, the condition must satisfy certain criteria. It cannot be illegal, related to fraudulent activities, impossible to fulfill, in violation of public policy, immoral, harmful to any person or their property. For example, if X transfers a property to Y with the condition that Y must commit a murder, such a transfer would be void because the condition is against the law. Therefore, conditional transfers are a common and important tool in property transactions. They allow transferors to place conditions or restrictions on the transferee's interest in the property. These transfers need to be carefully drafted, keeping in mind their validity under the law and ensuring they achieve the transfer's objectives. Proper understanding of the previous transfers is crucial for effective utilization of conditional transfers. The concept of conditional transfer. Conditional transfer refers to the process of transferring property that is contingent on certain prerequisites, which must either be satisfied before the transfer can take place or adhered to after the property has been transferred. The Transfer of Property Act 1882, Section 25 establishes the legal framework that governs such conditional property transfers. In simpler terms, conditional transfer can be understood as a contractual agreement wherein the transfer of ownership is not absolute or unconditional. Rather, the transfer is dependent on the occurrence or fulfillment of a specific stipulation or event. For example, if person A agrees to transfer property to person B, provided person B gets married within a specified time frame, then the condition of marriage must be met in order for the transfer of property to legally occur. The transfer is conditional upon the marriage taking place within the agreed upon period. Otherwise, the transfer will not be valid. Types of conditional transfer. Conditional transfer in the legal sense is nothing but the process of transferring of ownership rights conditionally provided that predefined as apparent to the property law. The nature and type of these attached conditions, however, may materially impact the already narrow nature of property rights, with varying legal difficulties for respective conditions categories. There are three primary classifications of conditions that can bear influence on property transfer arrangements: the condition precedent, the condition subsequent, and the collateral condition. In order for any of these conditional transfers to be valid, they must satisfy the stipulated criteria as dictated by Section 25 of the Transfer of Property Act. A condition precedent is a prerequisite that must first be fulfilled before any property can legally be transferred or conveyed from one owner to another. In essence, this type of condition comes before the actual transfer of ownership can properly occur. If this condition precedent is not fully satisfied, then by law the transfer of property cannot legally take place until it is resolved. This concept is described in Section 26 of the Transfer of Property Act. Importantly, these conditions do not always need to be fulfilled in a strict manner. Substantial compliance is often sufficient. For example, consider a situation where A intends to transfer property to B, but only if B obtains consent from three individuals X, Y, and Z prior to marrying. If Z passes away and B secures consent from X and Y afterward, the transfer can still proceed due to substantial compliance with the original condition. This principle was highlighted in the case of Dawson versus Oliver Massey. However, not all conditions are considered valid. In the significant case of Wilkinson versus Wilkinson, the court ruled against a condition requiring one party to abandon her husband for the transfer to take effect, deeming it contrary to public policy. The second one is condition subsequent. A condition subsequent, as defined in section 29 of the Transfer of Property Act, refers to a requirement that must be met before the property transfer has already occurred. Unlike conditions precedent, conditions subsequent must be strictly adhered to. Failure to comply can result in the transfer being voided. For instance, if A transfers property X to B on the condition that B must achieve a score of over 75% in university exams and B fails to meet that benchmark, the transfer will be annulled and ownership will revert to A. It is crucial that any condition subsequent is lawful. If it is not, the condition will be deemed void, allowing the transfer to remain intact. For example, A transfers property to B on the condition that B must commit a crime, such as murdering C. This condition would be void, meaning the transfer would still proceed and B would retain ownership. The third one is condition collateral. A collateral condition is one that needs to be fulfilled concurrently with the transfer of property. These conditions also require strict compliance. Failure to meet them could result in the transfer being nullified. For instance, A transfers property X to B on the condition that B must support A's wife for 10 years and B fulfills this obligation. The transfer remains valid and B retains ownership. Furthermore, a 2018 ruling of the Honorable Supreme Court furnished answers pertaining to conditional gifts. If a gift is made without any acknowledgement of acceptance and the donor retains possession of the gift during their lifetime, they have the option to revoke the gift. This is permissible as long as the revocation does not violate any legal principles governing valid property transfers, thus allowing the donor the right to cancel such a deed if they choose. To sum up, conditional transfers is a complex idea which needs to be thought about a conditions. The validity and the effects of property transfer is based in large part on whether the condition is precedent, subsequent or collateral. Conditions on which transfer will fail or void. Section 25 of the Transfer of Property Act 1882 outlines 6 types of conditions that, if imposed when transferring property, can lead to the transfer being considered void. Here is a breakdown of these conditions and their implications, illustrated through various cases. Impossible condition. In the case of Rajendra Lal versus Mrilanini Das, AIR 1922, in this case, the testator included a stipulation that the legality should dig a tank, but the tank has already been dug by the testator himself, which proves that the stipulation was not expressed without any object in view and was not an exclusionary condition, not merely referable to the respective legality, but a condition applied to the legality if performance of such testator was made simultaneously with the making of the will. It became impossible to fulfill this condition, so the bequest was void. This shows that if you can't realistically achieve something, if you can't make someone live forever or mandate a geometric impossibility, you are going to invalidate the property transfer. When it comes to defining the conditions in the course of a transfer, both parties involved must be careful because such condition must be feasible and consistent with the legal norm. A transfer could be declared nullified if the condition is impossible or if it contradicts the law and the public policy. Illegal conditions. According to the Transfer Property Act, a property can be transferred only if no such condition is prohibited by law, and if such a condition does not render the property void. For example, if someone wanted to transfer property with the proviso that the person on the receiving end was required to be involved in illegal activities, say drug trafficking, the transfer would fail. Or any condition that violates a tax or foreign labor law could void the transfer. For all parties involved, this means the conditions attached to the transfer must be legal, because anything illegal with the stipulation will preclude any possibility of the property being transferred to the intended recipient. Conditions inflicted harm. In the case of Ramalinga Padyachi versus Natesha Padyachi, a buyer named A was aware that the seller C did not have rightful ownership of the property. Knowing this, A made the purchase with the intent to hurt the real owner. When disputes with C arose over property losses, A sought compensation from C, but the court refused to allow such indemnity since A bought the property with malicious intent. Fraudulent conditions. When the terms of transferring ownership are deceitfully represented by the transferor, fraudulent conditions arises. For example, if a transferor claims that a certain payment is required for the transfer but never intends to transfer the property, this would constitute a fraudulent condition. In such scenarios, the transferee may have a legal recourse to rescind the transfer or seek damages due to the fraud. Immoral or public policy violations. In Wilkinson versus Wilkinson, the court found that an agreement whereby one person would financially assist another to divorce her husband and subsequently marry him was against public policy and thus void. The court deemed this arrangement immoral, violating societal norms. Similarly, in Ram Sarup versus Bela, it was determined that while a gift accompanied by an immoral condition is still valid, the immoral condition itself is void. Conversely, in Ghumman versus Ramchandra, the court find that the property transfers contingent on future immoral conduct is completely void. Conditional transfer and their legal effects. Conditional transfer is important because it understands the legal consequences of it. It ensures that rights of the participating parties are not undermined. These conditions are susceptible to being interpreted by the Transfer of Property Act and therefore made enforceable. Enforceability of conditions. The enforceability of the conditionality is one of the main concerns of conditional transfers. There is no need to recall that Section 6 of the Act expressly describes what counts as a valid condition. Void is a condition that is illegal, immoral, or against public policy. A transfer, for example, on the transferee being bought to understand unlawful activities would lack legal validity. In the meantime, the Act guarantees that there should not be any conditions to restrain alienation. This can be done to validate a condition preventing the transferee from transferring their interest in the property from being transferred. Effect of non-compliance. If, in the case of conditional transfers subject to precedent conditions, such a condition fails, the transfer becomes void. If the condition is not met, the transferee loses his right to the property. On the other hand, for succeeding conditions, the property shall be reverted to the original owner if the condition is violated. thus causing a loss of rights to the transferee. For example, a conditional transfer by which a property is passed on the condition that the transferee shall build a certain building within the prescribed time would be void in cases where the transferee fails to do so. On the contrary, if a property is transferred subject to a subsequent condition of non-construction, then the transfer is effective until the transferee commits a breach of such condition. Implied conditions and limitation. The Act reorganizes the concept of implied condition, that there may be some condition which are not presented in the transfer document but which are naturally a part of the transfer. These implied conditions may include conditions of keeping the property or of its use. These conditions might be enforced by legal interpretation. Judicial interpretation. Conditional transfers are equally important and they depend in part on judicial interpretation to understand and apply. Over the years, courts have had an opportunity to interpret various cases which in their way have helped into the essence of what the landscape is in terms of conditional transfers and rights of the parties. Conditional transfer can be made to impact heavily on the rights both of the transferor and of the transferee. It is important to understand these rights when they play an important role in understanding how to conduct property transactions. Right of the transferor. There are rights of the transferor over the property which will only be satisfied when the conditions are met. If a conditional transfer with the previous condition precedent is issued, a transferor has the right to reclaim the property in case of violating of a condition. In the case of subsequent conditions, then again the transferor may terminate the transfer on his own, having right to do this in case of the violation of the condition. Rights of the transferee. A conditional transfer gives the transferee rights which depend upon the nature of the conditional transfer. A precedent condition on a transfer may limit the transferee's right to all ownership until the condition is fulfilled. But as to successive conditions, the transferee may have immediate rights of occupancy and use of the property, but subject thereto to reversion in the event of violation of the condition. Third party rights. Third parties can also be impacted by the rights of conditional transfers. For example, if a property is moved conditionally and later the condition is burdened by a mortgage, right of the mortgagee may also be influenced by the conditions applied. Thus, the clarity and enforceability of conditions is really important from a legal standpoint for third parties involved in such transactions. Landmark judgments by the Supreme Court of India. Ram Ratan vs. State of UP. Here, the apex court was looking at the scope of conditional transfers under the Transfer of Property Act, specifically conditions which attract public policy. Any condition that promotes illegal activity renders the transfer void in view of the principles of legality and public interest, the court held. Krishna Ram Mahale versus Sri Hari K. Mahale. This judgment clarified when conditional limitations will be enforceable. The Supreme Court warned that future disputes would arise when conditions added to property transfers are vague and ambiguous. The ruling emphasized on the importance of providing clear phases in conditional transfers. Nirmal Chandra versus Union of India. The court held that failure of a condition doesn't necessarily render a transfer void, but rather damages the parties' rights and responsibilities. The decision clarified some conditions that affect property transactions and enforcements. Saraswati versus Kamal. In this most recent case, the Supreme Court found out whether or not such restrictions are valid for requirement in property transfers. The judgment confirmed that the conditional restrictions will be allowed provided that they are reasonable and do not inadequately interfere with the rights of the transferee. This judgment confirmed the balance of interest in between the transferor's intentions as regards the transfer and the transferee's entitlements. R.K. Sheshadri versus Ganga Bhavani. In this case, conditions precedent in property transfers were interpreted. The Supreme Court recognized the principle of substantial compliance and said that minor deviation from started condition which do not defeat it in essence do not disentitle the transfer. K. Venkatrao versus Dharampal. This judgment addressed the legal effects of conditions subsequent. Any failure to comply with the lawful condition subsequent could thereby cause the transfer to be revoked and ownership to be transferred back to the original transfer, the court reaffirmed. And in conclusion, conditional transfers are very important in carrying out a transaction in property. They essentially define the rights and responsibilities of the parties involved and are an instrumental part in which a property deal is and how it's understood. The Transfer of Property Act 1882 furnishes a definite frame for conducting conditional transfer. The law helps us to distinguish between conditions that must be met before and after, and thus tells us how these transfers work even if they are complicated. Finally, the mere insight into conditional transfers under the Transfer of Property Act is immensely important for those involved in property swaps. It is these conditions attached to these transfers that will either see the transfer carried out or not. It also decides who will have responsibilities and what rights when the transfer is done. That is what makes property transaction fair and clear. The principles underlying the conditionality of transfers of property will continue to be focal point of future review and adjustment in relation to the changing property laws and manner of transactions today. If we understand these rules, then the property transaction we conduct are fair to all parties, transparent and legal. I hope this lecture provided you with valuable insights into the conditional transfers and their legal implications. Thank you for watching this program.